"You don't belong on that bench." Sergeant Marcus Blake screamed before striking Judge Samuel Washington hard across the face in open court. That slap instantly became the beginning of the end for a career built on lies and cover-ups. This wasn't just an assault on a black judge. It was the moment someone finally pushed too far in front of the wrong person. Blake had no idea the man he attacked had been quietly reviewing files that certain people desperately wanted buried forever, including evidence about a case that destroyed families and reputations. What started as a routine family court hearing became the spark that ignited a federal investigation, exposing corruption at the highest levels. Watch till the end, because this time, when the system tried to protect its own, the whole foundation cracked, and what came next changed everything for those who thought they were untouchable. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in courtroom 4B of the Jefferson County Family Court, casting harsh shadows across the worn wooden benches where families gathered to seek protection for their most vulnerable. The morning docket seemed routine at first glance. A 14-year-old girl named Amara Williams, charged with displaying threatening behavior toward a law enforcement officer. The accusation, typed in cold, bureaucratic language, described a child who had allegedly maintained eye contact in a confrontational manner and failed to comply with verbal commands in a timely fashion. Judge Samuel Washington adjusted his reading glasses as he reviewed the case file, his withered fingers tracing lines of text that felt familiar in the worst possible way. 23 years on the bench, the last 12 in family court, had taught him to read between the lines of police reports, where the space between words often held more truth than the ink itself. This wasn't his first case involving Sergeant Marcus Blake, and the pattern emerging from the pages made his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Amara sat in the front row, her small frame dwarfed by the oversized chair, hands folded tightly in her lap as if trying to disappear. Her mother, Maria Williams, kept one protective arm around her daughter's shoulders while clutching a manila folder with her free hand. The folder contained school records, character references, and medical documentation of Amara's anxiety disorder, evidence of a child who had never been in trouble, whose greatest transgression was existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The courtroom door swung open with deliberate force, the brass handle striking the wall with a sound that commanded immediate attention. Sergeant Marcus Blake entered like a man stepping onto his own stage, his patrol uniform pressed to military precision, the leather of his duty belt creaking with each measured step. At 6 feet 3 inches, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, Blake carried himself with the unconscious arrogance of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. His pale blue eyes swept the courtroom with practiced assessment, lingering on Amara with the cold evaluation of a predator sizing up prey. When his gaze shifted to Judge Washington, something flickered across his expression. Not quite disrespect, not yet, but the kind of subtle challenge that spoke volumes about what he truly thought of the black man in robes who dared to question his judgment. "Your Honor," Blake said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. He didn't wait for permission to speak or acknowledge the court's protocols with even perfunctory respect. The subject displayed clear signs of aggression during the interaction. In my professional experience, that kind of defiant stare is often a precursor to violent resistance. Judge Washington looked up from the file, his dark eyes meeting Blake's pale ones with steady composure. "Sergeant Blake, you're referring to a 14-year-old girl who weighs 97 pounds. Could you please specify what aggressive actions you observed?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Blake's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the mask of professional courtesy slipped just enough to reveal something ugly underneath. She looked at me like she was challenging my authority. In my line of work, we can't afford to wait for defiance to escalate into violence. And what, specifically, did this defiance look like? Judge Washington's voice remained level, but those familiar with his courtroom could detect the sharpening edge beneath the calm surface. Blake shifted his weight, the leather of his gear squeaking softly in the silence. The way she held her head up, the duration of eye contact, the refusal to immediately look down when given a lawful order, these are all indicators we're trained to recognize. In the gallery, Maria Williams felt her daughter's body tense against her arm. This wasn't the first time they had heard these accusations, but hearing them spoken aloud in this sacred space felt like watching justice itself being stripped naked and humiliated. Judge Washington made a note in his file, the scratch of his pen unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He had seen this dance before, heard these same justifications dressed up in the language of officer safety and professional training. But something about this case felt different, more personal, as if Blake wasn't just defending his actions, but challenging the very right of a black judge to question a white officer's word. The first warning sign wasn't what Blake said. It was how he said it, with the casual confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for his choices. Samuel Washington had never intended to become a family court judge. Fresh out of law school 25 years ago, he had imagined himself in criminal court, prosecuting the kinds of dramatic cases that made headlines and built reputations. But life had taught him that the most important battles were often fought in quiet rooms over custody decisions and protection orders, where the stakes were measured not in years of imprisonment, but in the safety of children who had no voice of their own. His own childhood in East Baltimore had given him an education no law school could provide. He remembered being 10 years old, watching his mother navigate the court system alone, trying to get a restraining order against his father, while social workers, who looked nothing like them, made decisions about where he and his sister would sleep that night. The memory of feeling invisible in rooms full of people who were supposed to protect him had shaped every decision he'd made since. The family court appointment had come after 12 years as a prosecutor, where he had earned a reputation for being thorough, fair, and impossible to intimidate. Defense attorneys respected him because he never brought weak cases to trial. Prosecutors trusted him because he didn't play politics with people's lives. But it was the victims' families who had changed him, who had taught him that justice wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was simply about being heard by someone who cared enough to listen. His office walls told the story of that evolution. No diplomas or awards, just drawings from children he had helped remove from dangerous situations, thank you letters from mothers who had escaped abusive relationships, and a single photo of his own family. His wife of 30 years, Dr. Angela Washington, and their twin daughters, both now lawyers themselves. The photo sat next to a small wooden gavel, a gift from his first case as a family court judge, engraved with the words, "Justice begins with listening." Judge Washington's approach to the bench reflected the man he had become rather than the lawyer he had trained to be. He kept his courtroom warm in winter and cool in summer, understanding that comfort could mean the difference between a child speaking truthfully or remaining silent out of fear. He had learned to read body language, to notice when a parent's answers didn't match their child's flinches, to recognize the subtle signs of trauma that often went unnoticed in the formal machinery of legal proceedings. This morning, reviewing Amara Williams' case file, he had felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always preceded difficult decisions. The police report bore Sergeant Blake's signature, describing an encounter that seemed routine on paper, but felt wrong in ways that were hard to articulate. The language was too polished, too careful, filled with the kind of clinical descriptions that often masked more complex truths. Blake's name had appeared in his courtroom before, always in cases involving black children, always with the same language about threatening behavior and noncompliance. Judge Washington had made discreet inquiries with colleagues, discovering a pattern that troubled him deeply, but had never quite crossed the line into actionable concern. Blake was careful, professional in his reports, and backed by a department that had never seen fit to question his methods. But patterns told stories that individual cases could not, and Samuel Washington had not spent 2 decades protecting children to ignore the story that was slowly emerging from the files that crossed his desk. He had learned to trust his instincts, even when, especially when, those instincts put him at odds with the system he served. Looking at Amara Williams now, seeing the way she held herself with careful dignity despite her obvious fear, he was reminded of his own daughter at that age, walking into new schools with her head held high even when she was the only black face in her class. The comparison wasn't lost on him, nor was the responsibility it implied. Some fights chose you, regardless of whether you felt ready for them. The question wasn't whether Sergeant Blake had overstepped his authority. Judge Washington was increasingly certain that he had. The question was whether the system would support a black judge challenging a white officer's credibility, or whether he would find himself standing alone when the consequences came. The tension in courtroom 4B grew thick enough to taste as Sergeant Blake settled into the witness chair with the casual arrogance of a man who had never been seriously challenged in this setting. His uniform seemed to fill the space around him, the metal of his badge catching the overhead lights, a signal of untouchable authority. Judge Washington observed the performance with the practiced eye of someone who had seen power assert itself in countless forms, but rarely so brazenly. "Sergeant Blake," Judge Washington began, his voice maintaining its characteristic calm, "I'd like you to walk through the events of last Tuesday afternoon. Please be specific about the sequence of actions and your observations." Blake leaned back slightly, a gesture that would have been subtle if not for the context. In a courtroom where respect for judicial authority was foundational, even small displays of casual disregard carried weight. "I was conducting routine patrol in the Riverside District when I observed a group of juveniles congregating near the bus stop at 5th and Main. Based on recent reports of vandalism in the area, I decided to conduct a community contact." "And by community contact, you mean?" Judge Washington prompted. "I approached the group to assess the situation and ensure they weren't engaged in suspicious activity," Blake replied, his tone carrying the practiced patience of someone explaining obvious concepts to a slower student. "It's standard community policing, engaging with residents to maintain public safety." Judge Washington made a note, his pen moving deliberately across the legal pad. "How many juveniles were in this group?" "4. 3 males and 1 female. "And their approximate ages?" Blake shrugged, the motion causing his duty belt to creak. "Teenagers. 14 to 16, maybe 17 for the older boys." Yet only Miss Williams was cited. "Can you explain why?" For the first time, Blake's confidence flickered. He glanced toward the prosecution table, then back to Judge Washington, as if expecting support that wasn't forthcoming. "The others complied with my instructions immediately. The subject, Miss Williams, displayed behavior that required additional attention." "What specific behavior?" "She maintained direct eye contact when I told the group to disperse. When I addressed her directly, she didn't lower her gaze or acknowledge my authority. Her posture remained confrontational throughout the interaction." In the gallery, Maria Williams felt her daughter's hand find hers, small fingers intertwining with desperate need for comfort. Amara had told her mother what really happened that afternoon, how she had been waiting for the bus with friends, how Sergeant Blake had approached them aggressively, how she had been too scared to look away when he started yelling at them. But fear, apparently, looked like defiance to a man trained to see threats in the simple dignity of a black child refusing to be invisible. Judge Washington set down his pen and looked directly at Blake. "Sergeant, are you familiar with the Fourth Amendment protections regarding unreasonable search and seizure?" "Of course." Blake's answer came too quickly, carrying an edge of irritation that hadn't been there before. "Then you understand that citizens, including minors, have the right to remain in public spaces without being compelled to explain their presence unless there's reasonable suspicion of criminal activity." Blake's jaw tightened visibly. "Your Honor, with respect, I understand my job. These kids were loitering in an area with recent criminal activity. I had every right to investigate." "And Miss Williams' eye contact was criminal behavior how exactly?" The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down between two very different definitions of justice. Blake's pale eyes narrowed slightly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note that made several people in the courtroom sit up straighter. "Look, Your Honor, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know the difference between respect and defiance. That girl was looking at me like she had something to prove, and in my experience, that attitude leads to bigger problems if you don't address it immediately." "Bigger problems," Judge Washington repeated slowly, "such as resistance, escalation, the kind of situation where someone gets hurt." Blake leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a more intimate register. "I'm trying to prevent these kids from making mistakes that could ruin their lives. Sometimes it means teaching respect before it's too late." The words landed in the courtroom like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of discomfort that spread through the gallery. Judge Washington felt something shift inside him. Not anger, not yet, but a cold clarity that came when someone revealed more truth than they intended. The silence that followed Blake's statement felt different from the usual quiet of legal proceedings. This was the silence of people processing something that couldn't be unheard, words that had revealed too much about their speaker's true nature. "Sergeant Blake," Judge Washington said finally, replacing his glasses with precise movements, "did you just suggest that your role includes teaching respect to citizens who have committed no crime?" Blake's confident posture faltered slightly. Perhaps he sensed that he had ventured into dangerous territory, or perhaps he simply didn't like being questioned by someone he clearly viewed as inferior. "I said I was trying to prevent situations from escalating. That's good police work. By intimidating a 14-year-old girl for making eye contact." She wasn't intimidated. She was defiant. Blake's voice rose slightly, the professional veneer beginning to crack. These people need to understand that there are consequences for disrespectful behavior. The phrase, "these people," hung in the air like a neon sign, illuminating everything that had been implicit in the conversation up to this point. Judge Washington felt the familiar burning in his chest that came when prejudice revealed itself so nakedly that denial became impossible. Around the courtroom, he could see recognition dawning on faces, court staff, attorneys, observers, who had just witnessed a police officer categorize an entire group of people as inherently disrespectful. "These people, Sergeant Blake?" Judge Washington's voice remained steady, but something in his tone made Blake stiffen. "To whom, exactly, are you referring?" Blake realized his mistake too late. His face flushed red, and he glanced around the courtroom as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "I meant juvenile offenders, kids who don't understand proper behavior when dealing with law enforcement." "Miss Williams isn't a juvenile offender. She's an honor roll student with no prior arrests, no disciplinary problems at school, and no history of any kind of antisocial behavior. So, when you say these people, what criteria are you using to categorize her?" The question was surgical in its precision, cutting through every possible deflection to expose the raw nerve of Blake's prejudice. The sergeant's hands, which had been resting casually on the witness chair's armrests, clenched into fists. His breathing became more pronounced, the kind of physical tension that preceded either retreat or attack. "Your Honor, I don't appreciate the implication of your question." Blake's voice carried a warning that would have been shocking in any courtroom, but felt especially violative in this sacred space, where judicial authority was meant to be absolute. "I've served this community faithfully for 15 years. I've put my life on the line to protect people, including people who look like you and that girl." The phrase, "people who look like you," landed like a slap across every principle of judicial dignity and courtroom decorum. Judge Washington felt the collective intake of breath from the gallery, the sharp shock of witnessing someone challenge not just a judge's ruling, but his very right to occupy the bench. Maria Williams pulled her daughter closer, instinctively shielding her from the ugliness spilling into what should have been a place of protection. Judge Washington stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. At 6 feet tall, he wasn't as physically imposing as Blake, but his presence seemed to fill the courtroom in a way that had nothing to do with size. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every ancestor who had fought for the right of black men to sit in judgment of white men's actions. "Sergeant Blake, you will address this court with the respect it deserves, or you will be held in contempt. Your service record does not grant you the right to question the authority of this bench or to categorize citizens based on their race." Blake rose from the witness chair, his own height making him tower over the judicial bench in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. "I know exactly what kind of respect this court deserves," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "And I know the difference between justice and politics." The line had been crossed. In 30 years of legal practice, Judge Washington had never encountered such blatant disrespect for judicial authority, and everyone in the courtroom understood that what happened next would define more than just this case. The tension crackling between Judge Washington and Sergeant Blake had transformed the courtroom into something electric, dangerous, where every breath felt measured and every movement carried weight, beyond its physical presence. Jordan Martinez, the court's senior legal assistant, sat frozen at her desk near the judge's bench, her pen hovering over the transcript she could no longer pretend to focus on. In 15 years of recording court proceedings, she had never witnessed such naked antagonism directed at a sitting judge. Jordan's mind raced as she processed what she was witnessing. Blake's file had crossed her desk dozens of times over the past 3 years, and she had begun to notice patterns that troubled her professional conscience. Always black children. Always the same language about threatening behavior and noncompliance. Always cases that seemed to disappear into plea bargains or administrative resolutions that left no paper trail for appeal or review. She had mentioned her concerns to colleagues, but carefully, indirectly, in the way junior staff learned to raise uncomfortable questions without seeming to challenge their superiors. The response had always been the same. Blake was a decorated officer with commendations for community service. His reports were thorough and professional. If there were problems, surely his supervisors would have noticed. But watching him now, seeing the barely controlled rage in his eyes as he stared down a black judge, Jordan realized that the problem wasn't invisible. It was simply protected by willful blindness and institutional inertia. She quietly opened her laptop and began pulling up files, cross-referencing dates and case numbers, with a precision born of sudden, crystalline purpose. In the gallery, Maria Williams felt her daughter's trembling intensify as Blake's hostility filled the space around them. Amara had been struggling with anxiety since the incident last Tuesday, waking up in the middle of the night from dreams where large men in uniforms chased her through endless corridors. But seeing her mother's face now, tight with controlled anger and protective fierceness, gave her a different kind of education about courage under pressure. "Mama," Amara whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why is he so angry?" Maria Williams had been asking herself the same question for a week, ever since her daughter had come home from school shaking and confused about why waiting for a bus could suddenly become a crime. Now, watching Blake challenge a judge's authority with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced consequences, she understood that the answer was both simpler and more complex than she had imagined. "Because he's not used to being questioned by people who look like us, baby," she whispered back, her arm tightening around her daughter's shoulders. "But that's going to change today." Near the back of the courtroom, Davidson pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. As an investigative reporter for the Metro Herald, he had attended dozens of routine court hearings, usually searching for human interest stories or following up on cases with broader social implications. But what he was witnessing felt like something more significant, a moment when the careful facades that allowed institutional racism to function smoothly were being stripped away in real time. Chen had covered enough police misconduct stories to recognize the signs: the defensive aggression, the casual dehumanization, the assumption of immunity from consequences. But he had rarely seen it displayed so openly, with such confident contempt for oversight. His fingers moved across his phone's keyboard, sending messages to his editor and photographer, requesting immediate backup to document what might become a significant story. Other observers in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, some recognizing the historical weight of what they were witnessing. Mrs. Dorothy Henderson, a retired teacher who had attended court to support a neighbor's custody case, found herself thinking of her own grandsons, both teenagers, both tall and athletic, both subject to the same kind of scrutiny that had landed Amara Williams in this courtroom. She had lived through integration, had fought for the right of black children to attend decent schools, but had never imagined she would witness a police officer challenge a black judge's authority so brazenly. The courtroom had become a pressure cooker, filled with people who understood that they were watching something historic unfold, not because of its drama, but because of its naked honesty about power, race, and the fragility of progress that many had assumed was permanent. Judge Washington surveyed the faces around him, seeing recognition, concern, and anticipation. Whatever happened next would ripple far beyond this single case, and everyone present seemed to understand that they were about to become witnesses to something that would demand they choose sides. The lunch recess provided no relief from the tension that had built like storm pressure in courtroom 4B. Judge Washington retreated to his chambers, closing the door with deliberate care before allowing himself a moment to process what had just occurred. In 3 decades of legal practice, he had faced hostility, prejudice, and professional challenges, but never such brazen disrespect for the judicial process itself. Blake's behavior suggested a man who believed himself immune from consequences, a dangerous assumption that usually came from experience rather than arrogance. Jordan Martinez knocked softly on the chamber door, her arms full of files and her laptop balanced precariously on top. "Your Honor, I need to show you something." She spread the documents across his desk with the methodical precision of someone who had spent hours organizing evidence into an undeniable pattern. Case files, incident reports, and court transcripts formed a timeline that stretched back 3 years, each bearing Sergeant Blake's signature and disturbingly similar language. "I've been tracking these for months," Jordan said, her voice tight with controlled urgency. "Always black children, between 13 and 17. Always the same charges: disorderly conduct, threatening behavior, failure to comply. But look at this." She pointed to a series of dates highlighted in yellow. Every case that went to trial was either plea bargained down or dismissed on procedural grounds. The families never got their day in court. Judge Washington studied the documents with growing unease. The pattern was unmistakable. Blake targeted black children with the confidence of someone who knew the system would support his version of events. But there was something else, a gap in the timeline that suggested missing pieces. "What about this period?" he asked, pointing to a 6-month span with no Blake-related cases. "February through August, 3 years ago." Jordan's expression darkened. "That's when the Isaiah Parker case happened. Blake was on administrative leave during the investigation, but he was cleared and returned to duty with a commendation for heroism under fire." The name Isaiah Parker triggered a memory that Judge Washington had tried to suppress. He remembered the news coverage. A 15-year-old boy shot during what police described as an armed robbery attempt. The case had been handled in criminal court, not family court, but the story had haunted him because Isaiah Parker had been the same age as his own daughters, another black child whose life had been reduced to a paragraph in the newspaper. "Do you have access to the Parker file?" Jordan hesitated. "Not officially. It was sealed after the administrative review." "But—" She pulled out a manila envelope from the bottom of her stack. "I have a contact in records who thought someone should see the original incident report before it was amended." The document Jordan handed him was a photocopy, but clear enough to read the handwritten notes in the margins, notes that had been omitted from the final, official report. Judge Washington read with mounting horror. Subject appeared to be running away when engagement began. No weapon recovered at scene. Officer Blake's initial statement inconsistent with physical evidence. But it was the final note, written in different handwriting, that made his blood run cold. Recommend administrative resolution. Media attention minimal. Family unlikely to pursue civil action. "Jordan," Judge Washington said slowly, "who else has seen this?" "My contact destroyed the original after making this copy. She was scared. Said too many people were asking questions about Parker's death, and then suddenly they all stopped asking." Jordan's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "Your Honor, I think Isaiah Parker was murdered, and I think Blake has been getting away with targeting black children ever since because he knows nobody will challenge him. What would you do if your child was next?" Judge Washington stared at the documents spread across his desk, each one representing a family's trust in a system that had failed them systematically. The case before him was no longer about Amara Williams's right to make eye contact with a police officer. It was about a pattern of abuse that had been enabled by institutional indifference and protected by administrative silence. The afternoon session would resume in 20 minutes, and Sergeant Blake would return to the witness stand, expecting the same deference he had always received. But Judge Washington now understood that this case was bigger than one man's prejudices or one child's dignity. This was about whether the system he had devoted his life to serving was capable of confronting its own failures, even when those failures wore badges and hid behind the language of public safety. The question was no longer whether he had the authority to challenge Blake. It was whether he had the courage to follow the evidence wherever it led, regardless of the consequences for his career or his safety. The afternoon session began with a different energy, as if the very air in courtroom 4B had been charged with electricity. Judge Washington entered with measured steps, carrying himself with the same dignified composure that had defined his career, but those who knew him well could detect something harder in his posture, a resolve that hadn't been there that morning. Jordan Martinez had positioned herself at her desk with strategic precision, the copied documents within easy reach, but carefully concealed beneath routine paperwork. Sergeant Blake returned to the witness stand with the swagger of a man who believed he had established dominance during the morning session. His uniform remained crisp despite the day's tensions, his badge catching the overhead lights like a talisman of untouchable authority. He settled into the chair with casual ownership, as if the witness stand was simply another space where his will would naturally prevail. "Sergeant Blake," Judge Washington began, his voice carrying a new edge that made several observers sit up straighter. "I'd like to revisit your earlier testimony about community policing practices. How long have you been assigned to patrol the Riverside District?" Blake's eyebrows rose slightly, perhaps surprised by the change in tone, but not yet concerned. 3.5 years, Your Honor, since I returned from administrative leave in September 2020. And during that time, how many juveniles would you estimate you've cited for behavioral violations? I don't keep exact counts, but probably 40 or 50 cases. Most of them resolved without trial. Kids learn their lesson and stay out of trouble. Blake's answer came easily, delivered with the confidence of someone who had never been required to justify his methods in detail. Judge Washington made a note, his pen moving deliberately across the legal pad. "Of those 40 or 50 cases, can you estimate what percentage involved minority juveniles?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Blake's confident expression flickered, and he glanced toward the prosecution table before answering. "I don't pay attention to race, Your Honor. I respond to behavior, not demographics." "That's admirable, Sergeant, but surely you can provide a rough estimate." "Half. 3/4. Blake shifted in his chair, the leather of his duty belt creaking audibly in the courtroom silence. "I patrol an area with diverse demographics. The citations reflect the population I serve. According to census data, the Riverside District is 43% black. Would you say your citations reflect that demographic breakdown?" The mathematical precision of the question left no room for deflection. Blake's jaw tightened visibly, and when he spoke, his voice carried an edge of irritation that hadn't been there before. "Your Honor, I don't think racial percentages are relevant to this case. We're here about one specific incident involving one specific individual who displayed inappropriate behavior." "Actually, Sergeant Blake, we're here because you swore an oath to tell the truth about your actions as a law enforcement officer. A pattern of behavior is absolutely relevant to credibility." Judge Washington's voice remained calm, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "So, I'll ask again, what percentage of your juvenile citations involve minority children?" Blake's hands clenched on the armrests of the witness chair. Around the courtroom, people leaned forward almost imperceptibly, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The sergeant's pale eyes locked onto Judge Washington's dark ones, and for a moment, the room felt charged with the same dangerous energy that preceded lightning strikes. "Most of them," Blake said finally, the words forced out through clenched teeth. "But that's because minority kids in that neighborhood are more likely to engage in disrespectful behavior toward authority figures. It's a cultural problem, not a policing problem." The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Maria Williams felt her daughter's hand tighten in hers, while Jordan Martinez began typing rapidly on her laptop, documenting every word of Blake's damning testimony. In the gallery, David Chen activated his phone's recording app, understanding that he was witnessing something that would demand immediate coverage. Judge Washington removed his glasses and cleaned them with deliberate care, a gesture that gave him time to process the magnitude of what Blake had just confessed. When he replaced them and looked up, his expression was that of a man who had just watched someone hang themselves with their own rope. "A cultural problem, Sergeant Blake? Could you elaborate on what you mean by that?" Blake realized too late that he had ventured into indefensible territory, but his pride wouldn't allow him to retreat. These kids grow up thinking they don't have to show respect to authority. Their parents don't teach them proper behavior, so society has to step in and provide the education they're not getting at home. The courtroom erupted in a low murmur of shocked voices, quickly silenced by Judge Washington's raised hand. But the damage was done. Blake had revealed the prejudiced assumptions that drove his policing style with a clarity that made denial impossible. The weight of Blake's words settled over courtroom, for be like toxic smoke, making breathing feel labored and dangerous. Judge Washington sat in perfect stillness for nearly 30 seconds, allowing the full impact of the sergeant's testimony to penetrate every corner of the room. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken only by the soft scratch of Jordan Martinez's pen as she documented what might prove to be the most crucial moments of the entire proceeding. In the gallery, Maria Williams felt something shift inside her chest, not the sharp pain of fresh injury, but the slow, steady burn of anger that had been building for years without a proper outlet. She had spent her daughter's entire childhood teaching Amara to be respectful, polite, and careful around authority figures, understanding instinctively that survival often depended on making herself invisible to people like Sergeant Blake. But watching this man dismiss her parenting, her community, and her child's dignity with such casual contempt, she realized that respectability had never been protection. It had only been another form of submission. David Chen's fingers moved rapidly across his phone screen, sending preliminary reports to his editor with subject lines that reflected the historic nature of what he was witnessing. Police officer admits racial bias on witness stand. Family court hearing becomes civil rights moment. Judge challenges systemic police misconduct in real time. His years of covering social justice issues had taught him to recognize inflection points, and this felt like one of those rare moments when institutional masks slipped completely away. Near the back of the courtroom, Mrs. Dorothy Henderson found herself thinking of her own encounters with police officers over the decades, the careful deference she had learned to display, the way she had taught her children and grandchildren to move through the world with hands visible and voices quiet. She had accepted these accommodations as the price of peace, but hearing Blake's testimony, she realized that no amount of respectability would ever be enough for someone who viewed her very existence as inherently suspicious. Judge Washington finally spoke, his voice carrying a quietness that somehow felt more powerful than shouting. Sergeant Blake, in your opinion, what would constitute appropriate behavior from a black teenager during a police encounter? Blake's confidence was wavering now, but his pride continued to drive him forward into increasingly dangerous territory. The same as any other kid, immediate compliance, respectful language, no attitude or challenging behavior. And if a child maintains eye contact while complying with your instructions? Eye contact can be a form of challenge, depending on the context and duration. What about asking questions about why they're being stopped? Blake's irritation flared visibly. Questions are often just disguised arguments. A respectful person follows instructions first and asks questions later, if at all. Judge Washington made another note, each question and answer building towards something that everyone in the courtroom could feel approaching but couldn't yet define. So, in your professional opinion, a black teenager should avoid eye contact, should not ask questions about their rights, and should demonstrate immediate submission to your authority, regardless of whether they've committed any crime? The question was crafted with surgical precision, forcing Blake to either admit to unconstitutional policing practices or contradict his previous testimony. Blake's face flushed red as he realized the trap that had been carefully constructed around him, word by word, answer by answer. I didn't say anything about race, he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. I said all teenagers should show respect to law enforcement. Yet 97% of your juvenile citations in the past 3 years have involved black children, Judge Washington said quietly, consulting the notes Jordan had discreetly passed to him. That's a remarkable coincidence for someone who claims not to see color. Blake's hands gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles went white. Those are just statistics. They don't prove anything about my motives. Perhaps not, but combined with your testimony about cultural problems and the need to educate children whose parents allegedly haven't taught them proper behavior, they paint a rather clear picture of your approach to community policing. The courtroom felt like a coiled spring, tension building toward some inevitable release. Blake's breathing had become audible, short, sharp intakes that suggested a man fighting to maintain control. His eyes darted around the room, perhaps noticing for the first time the faces watching him. Black faces, white faces, all wearing expressions of recognition and dawning understanding. "Your Honor," Blake said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "I've served this community faithfully for 15 years. I've put my life on the line to protect people, including people who look like you. I don't appreciate having my service record questioned by someone who's never walked a beat or faced real danger." The phrase, "people who look like you," hit the courtroom like a physical slap. Judge Washington felt the collective gasp from the gallery, the sharp shock of witnessing someone cross a line that should have been inviolable. But he also felt something else rising inside him. Not anger, but a cold, crystalline clarity that came when someone revealed their true nature so completely that pretense became impossible. "Sergeant Blake," Judge Washington said, rising slowly from his chair, "your service record is not being questioned. Your judgment, your methods, and your apparent belief that a citizen's race determines their worthiness of constitutional protection, those are being questioned, and rightfully so." Blake stood as well, his height making him tower over the judicial bench in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. The physical mismatch was obvious. Blake's 6 feet 3 inches frame, broad shoulders, and tactical gear versus Judge Washington's slender build and black robes. But everyone in the courtroom understood that true power in this space came not from physical presence, but from moral authority. "I know exactly what this is about," Blake said, his voice carrying a menace that made several people in the gallery shift uncomfortably. "This is about politics, not justice. This is about protecting criminals instead of victims. This is about turning law enforcement into social work." The mask had finally fallen completely away. Jordan Martinez typed frantically, capturing every word of what was essentially a confession of the prejudices that had driven Blake's career. David Chun moved closer to the front of the courtroom, understanding that he was witnessing something that would demand national attention. Judge Washington remained standing, his posture straight and dignified despite the obvious threat in Blake's words. "Sergeant Blake, this is about equal protection under the law. This is about whether a 14-year-old girl has the right to exist in a public space without being criminalized for the color of her skin." The two men faced each other across the fundamental divide that had always existed in American justice. The gap between the law as written and the law as practiced, between the promise of equality and the reality of selective enforcement. Something was about to break. The courtroom fell into the kind of silence that preceded earthquakes, not peaceful, but charged with potential energy that needed only the smallest trigger to be released. Judge Washington and Sergeant Blake stood facing each other across an ideological chasm that had been building throughout the afternoon, each representing not just their individual positions, but entire worldviews about power, race, and justice in America. Jordan Martinez had been waiting for this moment, her laptop open to a folder she had labeled Parker Investigation months ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she double-clicked on a video file that should have remained buried forever in police department servers. The footage began loading with agonizing slowness, each pixel representing the difference between official narrative and documented truth. "Your Honor," Jordan said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "I have evidence relevant to Sergeant Blake's pattern of behavior with minority youth." Blake's head snapped toward her, his eyes widening with something that might have been recognition or might have been fear. "This is about the Williams case," he said quickly. "Whatever games you're playing with old files has nothing to do with current charges." Judge Washington looked from Blake to Jordan, understanding that something crucial was about to be revealed. "What evidence, Ms. Martinez?" Jordan stood, her small frame somehow commanding the attention of everyone in the courtroom. Body camera footage from the Isaiah Parker incident 3 years ago, the original footage, before it was ruled inadmissible due to technical issues. The name Isaiah Parker dropped into the courtroom like a stone into still water, sending ripples of recognition through those old enough to remember the case. Blake's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, and finally cold calculation. "That footage was classified," Blake said, his voice low and dangerous. If you have access to sealed evidence, you've committed a felony. The footage was leaked to me by someone who couldn't live with the cover-up, Jordan replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. Someone who understood that some truths are too important to keep buried. Judge Washington felt the weight of history settling over his courtroom. Whatever was on that video would either vindicate Blake's version of events or destroy him completely. There was no middle ground, no room for interpretation or administrative resolution. "Play the footage," he said quietly. The courtroom's attention shifted to the large monitor mounted on the wall, its blank screen reflecting the faces of people who understood they were about to witness something that would change everything. Blake remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides, watching the screen with the expression of a man staring at his own execution. The video began with the jerky, low-resolution quality of body camera footage. The timestamp showed a date 3 years ago, and the location was a convenience store parking lot in the same Riverside district where Blake now patrolled. The audio crackled to life with Blake's voice, younger sounding but unmistakably his. "Subject appears to be running from the scene, in pursuit on foot." The camera bounced as Blake ran, showing glimpses of a slight figure in dark clothing moving between parked cars. The figure stumbled, fell, and Blake's camera captured a clear view of Isaiah Parker's face. Young, terrified, obviously unarmed, hands raised in surrender. "Please, don't shoot." Isaiah's voice came through the speakers, high and desperate. "I didn't do anything. I was just walking home." Blake's recorded voice was cold, professional. "Subject is resisting arrest, preparing to deploy force." But the video showed something different. Isaiah Parker wasn't resisting. He was cowering, hands visible, backing away with the slow, careful movements of someone trying desperately not to be perceived as a threat. The disconnect between Blake's narration and the visual evidence was stark, undeniable. Subject reaching for potential weapon. Blake's voice continued, but the camera clearly showed Isaiah's empty hands raised above his head. The courtroom watched in horrified silence as the truth of Isaiah Parker's death played out on screen. Not the heroic law enforcement action described in official reports, but the execution of a terrified child who had committed no crime beyond existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. How many families are still waiting for justice? Judge Washington thought, his eyes fixed on the screen. Blake's face had gone pale, his earlier arrogance replaced by the desperate look of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. The video continued to play, each frame stripping away years of carefully constructed lies and administrative cover-ups. Isaiah Parker's final moments unfolded with terrible clarity. A 15-year-old boy pleading for his life, hands raised in surrender, while Sergeant Blake's recorded voice created a false narrative of resistance and threat that would later justify his actions to investigators who were all too willing to accept his version of events. "I don't have a gun." Isaiah's voice cracked through the courtroom speakers, young and desperate. "Please, I don't have anything. I was just buying chips for my little sister." The convenience store receipt found in Isaiah's pocket after his death had shown exactly that. A bag of chips and a soda, purchased 3 minutes before the shooting. But that detail had been buried in the administrative review, deemed irrelevant to the determination of whether Blake had acted within policy. Subject making aggressive movements toward waistband area. Threat assessment indicates immediate danger to officer safety. Blake's voice continued, but the camera showed Isaiah backing against a chain-link fence, tears streaming down his face, hands never leaving their raised position. The boy was trapped, terrified, and completely defenseless when Blake fired 3 shots into his chest from a distance of less than 10 feet. The audio captured Isaiah's final words, "Tell my mama I love her." The silence that followed in the courtroom was profound, broken only by the soft sound of Maria Williams crying and the sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Dorothy Henderson in the back row. Judge Washington felt something fundamental shift inside him, not just anger at Blake's actions, but fury at the system that had allowed this murder to be classified as justified force. Blake remained standing at the witness stand, his face cycling through expressions of defiance, fear, and calculation. When he spoke, his voice carried none of its earlier authority. "That video doesn't show the full context," he said desperately. There were other factors, intelligence reports about weapons in the area. You can't judge a split-second decision based on incomplete footage. Jordan Martinez had prepared for this moment, pulling up additional files on her laptop with the methodical precision of someone who had spent months building an unassailable case. "The complete police report," she said, projecting the document onto the courtroom monitor. No mention of weapons intelligence, no radio calls about suspicious activity, no indication that Isaiah Parker was anything other than a child walking home from the store. The report appeared on screen, bearing Blake's signature and the signatures of 3 supervising officers who had signed off on his version of events without question. The official narrative bore no resemblance to what the video had shown. It described an armed suspect, aggressive behavior, and justified use of deadly force in the face of imminent danger. David Chun had stopped taking notes, understanding that his story had evolved from a courtroom confrontation into something much larger: the exposure of systematic police misconduct and the institutional mechanisms that protected killer cops from consequences. His phone was recording continuously now, capturing both the video evidence and the reactions of people witnessing the truth for the first time. "Your Honor," Blake said, his voice taking on a pleading quality that contrasted sharply with his earlier arrogance, "I followed department protocol. I was cleared by Internal Affairs and the District Attorney's Office. This case was closed years ago." Judge Washington looked at the man before him, no longer the confident officer who had entered his courtroom that morning, but a desperate individual watching his carefully constructed world collapse under the weight of documented truth. "Sergeant Blake," Judge Washington said, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority backed by moral clarity, "this case may have been closed by administrative convenience, but it was never closed by justice. The murder of Isaiah Parker was covered up by a system more interested in protecting its reputation than protecting the children it was sworn to serve." Blake's eyes darted around the courtroom, perhaps searching for support that was no longer there. Even the prosecutor assigned to the Williams case had gone silent, understanding that continuing to defend Blake would mean defending the indefensible. "I want to know," Judge Washington continued, "how many other Isaiah Parkers there have been. How many other families have been told their children's deaths were justified while video evidence of murder gathered dust in police servers?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to every institution that had enabled Blake's career, every official who had signed off on his reports, every system that had prioritized order over truth. The revelation of Isaiah Parker's murder had transformed the courtroom into something beyond a legal proceeding. It had become a reckoning with the fundamental nature of justice in America. Judge Washington sat back down, his hands folded carefully on the bench, while Blake remained standing at the witness stand, like a man caught in a spotlight with nowhere to hide. "Sergeant Blake," Judge Washington said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone delivering judgment, "you've just watched video evidence of yourself murdering an unarmed child. You've heard his final words. You've seen him beg for his life. And your response is to claim that this was justified police work." Blake's jaw worked silently for several seconds before he found his voice. It was a split-second decision in a dangerous situation. Every officer knows that hesitation can mean death. "I followed my training." "Your training taught you to execute surrendering children?" "My training taught me to neutralize threats before they neutralize me." Blake's voice was rising, desperation bleeding through his attempts at professional composure. "You sit up there in your robe, making judgments about situations you've never faced. You don't know what it's like to make life-or-death decisions in the field." Judge Washington leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Blake's face. "You're right, Sergeant. I've never murdered a child and then lied about it for 3 years. I've never covered up evidence of my own crimes. I've never hidden behind a badge while destroying families with my prejudice and violence." The words hit Blake like physical blows. His face flushed red, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You think you're better than me? You think wearing that robe makes you some kind of moral authority?" "I think taking an oath to protect and serve means something more than hunting black children for sport," Judge Washington replied, his voice remaining calm despite the explosive tension building in the room. Blake took a step closer to the bench, his movement causing several people in the gallery to shift nervously. You don't know anything about the real world. You don't know what these people are capable of when you're not watching. These people again, Sergeant Blake? Judge Washington stood up, matching Blake's aggressive posture with quiet dignity. You mean children like Isaiah Parker? Like Amara Williams? Like the dozens of other black youth you've terrorized with the confidence that the system would never hold you accountable? Blake's mask of professional authority had completely crumbled, revealing the raw hatred underneath. You want to know the truth? Fine. These kids grow up thinking they own the streets. They think they can disrespect authority and get away with it. They think their attitude problems should be tolerated because of their skin color. I've seen what happens when you let them get away with defiance. They escalate. They become criminals. They join gangs. They destroy communities. Sometimes stopping one prevents 10 others from following the same path. Jordan Martinez typed frantically, documenting every word of Blake's self-incriminating rant. David Chun activated his phone's video function, understanding that Blake was providing a masterclass in how institutional racism justified itself through dehumanization and fear. So, Isaiah Parker had to die to send a message. Judge Washington's voice cut through Blake's tirade like a scalpel. A 15-year-old boy buying chips for his sister deserved execution because you decided he represented some future threat. Blake realized he had said too much, revealed too much, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat. I protected this community from someone who would have grown up to be a problem. That boy was already showing signs of defiance. His attitude toward authority was clear from his body language. His body language, Judge Washington repeated slowly. You murdered a child because you didn't like his body language. The stark simplicity of the statement stripped away every layer of justification, every professional euphemism, every attempt to dress murder up as law enforcement. Blake stood exposed as what he had always been, not a protector, but a predator who had used his badge to hunt children with impunity. You people always twist things, Blake snarled, his voice dripping with contempt. You always make it about race when it's about respect. It's about law and order. The phrase, you people, sealed his fate, removing any possibility of walking back his confessions or claiming his words had been misunderstood. Judge Washington had heard enough. The man standing before him had confessed to murder, admitted to systematic racial profiling, and revealed a worldview so poisoned by hatred that redemption seemed impossible. But there was one more piece of evidence that needed to be revealed, one final nail in the coffin of Blake's career and credibility. Miss Martinez, Judge Washington said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had reached the end of his patience. Please play the audio file. Jordan's fingers moved across her laptop keyboard with practiced precision, calling up a sound file that she had been saving for this moment. The courtroom speakers crackled to life with voices that were clearly recognizable as Blake and another man, recorded in what sounded like a bar or restaurant setting. The problem with policing today, Blake's recorded voice said, slightly slurred but unmistakably his, is that we're not allowed to do our jobs properly anymore. Every time we take down one of these thugs, some bleeding heart judge or activist starts crying about excessive force. The second voice, identified by Jordan as Lieutenant Brooks, Blake's immediate supervisor, responded with a laugh. Tell me about it. Remember that Parker kid? Little punk got exactly what he deserved, but we had to dance around the family's feelings for months. That boy was asking for it. Blake's voice continued, clear and unrepentant, walking around like he owned the neighborhood, giving me attitude when I tried to question him. These kids need to learn that actions have consequences. Too bad there aren't more cops willing to teach that lesson. Brooks replied, maybe we'd have fewer problems in these communities if more of them understood what happens when you disrespect authority. Blake laughed, the sound chilling in its casual cruelty. Don't worry about that. I make sure every kid in my district knows the score. Most of them learn real quick after they see what happened to their friend Isaiah. The audio continued for several more minutes, documenting a conversation between two police officers celebrating the murder of a child and using it as a tool of intimidation against other black youth in their district. The recording captured not just Blake's guilt, but the institutional support that had enabled his crimes. In the courtroom, Blake's face had gone ashen. He stared at the speakers as if they were broadcasting his own death sentence, which, in many ways, they were. "Where did you get that?" Blake whispered, his voice barely audible. "Someone who couldn't live with the silence anymore," Jordan replied. "Someone who understood that covering up murder makes you complicit in it." Judge Washington felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. The man before him had spent 3 years believing he was untouchable, protected by institutional loyalty and administrative indifference. But truth had a way of surfacing, especially when good people decided that their consciences mattered more than their careers. "Sergeant Blake," Judge Washington said, his voice carrying the finality of judgment, "you have just been exposed as a murderer who used his position to terrorize black children with the full knowledge and support of your superiors. You have confessed to systematic racial profiling, to using Isaiah Parker's death as a tool of intimidation, and to viewing the murder of children as an acceptable method of community control." Blake opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What defense could he offer against his own recorded voice? What justification could survive the clarity of documented confession? "Furthermore," Judge Washington continued, "you have revealed a culture of police misconduct that extends far beyond your individual actions. Lieutenant Brooks, your supervisor, is heard on this recording celebrating the murder of a child and encouraging more violence against black youth." The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about one rogue officer. It was about an entire system that had been corrupted from the ground up, where murdering children was seen as acceptable policy as long as the victims were black. David Chun was already composing headlines in his mind. "Police officer confesses to murder on audio recording. Supervisor celebrates killing of black teenager. Federal investigation imminent after courtroom revelations." The story had exploded far beyond a simple disorderly conduct case into a national scandal that would demand immediate federal intervention. The weight of Blake's exposed crimes hung over courtroom for be like a toxic cloud, making every breath feel labored and dangerous. Judge Washington sat in perfect stillness, allowing the full implications of the audio recording to settle into the consciousness of everyone present. Blake stood at the witness stand, like a man watching his entire world collapse in real time, his earlier swagger replaced by the desperate look of someone with no way out. The silence stretched for nearly a minute, broken only by the soft sound of Maria Williams crying and the rapid clicking of Jordan Martinez's keyboard as she documented every detail of Blake's psychological collapse. David Chen moved closer to the front of the courtroom, understanding that he was witnessing something that would dominate headlines for months to come. Finally, Blake found his voice, though it came out as a harsh whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "You set me up. This whole thing was a setup from the beginning." Judge Washington removed his glasses and cleaned them with deliberate care, a gesture that gave him time to consider his words while the tension in the room built toward some inevitable explosion. "Sergeant Blake, the only person who set you up was yourself. Every word on that recording came from your mouth. Every confession was your choice." Blake's hands were trembling now, his face cycling between rage and panic as he realized that there was no way to undo the damage he had inflicted on himself. "You don't understand the pressure we're under. You don't know what it's like to patrol these neighborhoods, to deal with these people every single day." "These people," Judge Washington repeated, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of injustice. "How you keep using that phrase, Sergeant Blake. What exactly do you mean by these people?" Blake's composure finally shattered completely. The careful mask of professional authority that he had maintained throughout his career fell away, revealing the raw hatred that had always driven his actions. His voice rose to a shout that echoed off the marble walls of the courtroom. "You know exactly what I mean. These thugs, these criminals, these people who think they can disrespect authority and get away with it." Blake's face was flushed red, spittle flying from his lips as years of suppressed rage poured out. "You sit up there in your fancy robe, pretending to care about justice, but you're just protecting your own kind." The phrase, "your own kind," hit the courtroom like a physical slap. Judge Washington felt the collective gasp from the gallery, the sharp intake of breath that came when someone crossed a line that should never be crossed. But he also felt something else rising inside him, Not anger, but a cold, crystalline clarity that came when someone revealed their true nature so completely that pretense became impossible. Judge Washington stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. At his full height, he still wasn't as physically imposing as Blake, but his presence seemed to fill the courtroom in a way that had nothing to do with size. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of every principle that Blake had just violated. "Sergeant Blake, you will address this court with respect, or you will be held in contempt. Your years of service do not give you the right to use racial slurs in my courtroom." Blake took a step toward the bench, his height and bulk making him tower over the judicial platform in a way that felt deliberately threatening. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he screamed, his voice cracking with fury and desperation. "Just because you wear a damn judge's robe, you think you can order me around?" Before anyone could react, before security could intervene, before the weight of institutional authority could assert itself, Blake's hand swung in a wide arc that connected with Judge Washington's face, with a sound like thunder. Crack! The slap echoed through the marble halls of justice, with a finality that seemed to stop time itself. Judge Washington's head snapped to the side, but his body didn't move. He absorbed the blow with the same dignity he had shown throughout the hearing, his eyes never closing, his posture never wavering. The courtroom fell into a silence so complete that the only sound was Blake's heavy breathing and the distant hum of fluorescent lights. Every person present understood that they had just witnessed something historic, not just an assault on a judge, but the moment when the mask of institutional authority was stripped away to reveal the ugliness beneath. Judge Washington slowly turned his face back toward Blake, the red handprint stark against his dark skin, his eyes holding a calm that was more devastating than any rage could have been. The aftermath of Blake's attack unfolded with surreal clarity, as if time had slowed to allow everyone present to fully absorb the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Judge Washington remained standing, the red mark of Blake's hand vivid against his cheek, but his expression held no trace of pain or anger, only the quiet dignity of someone who had absorbed an assault against justice itself and refused to be broken by it. Blake stood frozen, his hand still raised from the blow, his face cycling through expressions of shock, defiance, and dawning horror as he realized what he had done. The courtroom security officers, momentarily stunned by the unprecedented nature of the attack, suddenly moved into action with practiced efficiency. "Step away from the bench!" The lead security officer's voice cut through the silence like a whip crack. Two officers approached Blake from either side, their movements careful but determined, understanding that they were dealing with an armed individual who had just crossed every line of acceptable behavior. But Judge Washington raised his own hand, stopping the officers in their tracks. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and clear, carrying the authority of someone who had just been physically assaulted but refused to be diminished by it. "I want this act formally recorded," he said, his eyes never leaving Blake's face. "Let the record show that Sergeant Marcus Blake, while under oath as a witness in this court, has physically assaulted a sitting judge in open session before multiple witnesses." Jordan Martinez's fingers flew across her keyboard, documenting every detail of the attack and its aftermath. Davidson held his phone steady, recording both the red mark on Judge Washington's face and Blake's expression of mounting panic as he realized that his career, his freedom, and his future had just been destroyed by a moment of uncontrolled rage. Furthermore, Judge Washington continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "Let the record show that this assault occurred immediately after Sergeant Blake was confronted with audio evidence of his confessing to the murder of Isaiah Parker and his systematic targeting of black children in his patrol area." Blake's legs seemed to give way slightly, and he sank back into the witness chair, as if the weight of his actions had suddenly become unbearable. "I didn't mean. I wasn't thinking clearly." "You were thinking very clearly, Sergeant Blake," Judge Washington replied, dabbing at his cheek with a tissue that Jordan had discreetly provided. "You were thinking that a black judge had no right to hold you accountable for your actions. You were thinking that your badge gave you immunity from consequences. You were thinking that violence was an appropriate response to being confronted with your crimes." The courtroom doors opened to admit 3 federal agents, their timing so precise that it seemed choreographed. The lead agent, a stern-faced woman in a dark suit, approached the bench with credentials already in hand. "Your Honor, I'm Agent Sarah Martinez, with the FBI Civil Rights Division. We've been monitoring this proceeding based on evidence that was brought to our attention earlier today." She gestured toward Blake, who was now slumped in the witness chair like a deflated balloon. "We have warrants for Sergeant Blake's arrest on federal charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice." Blake looked up with wild eyes, perhaps only now understanding that his assault on Judge Washington had been witnessed not just by local court personnel, but by federal law enforcement officials who had been building a case against him. "This is all a setup," he said desperately. "They planned this whole thing to entrap me." Agent Martinez approached Blake, with handcuffs, her expression professionally neutral. "Sergeant Marcus Blake, you are under arrest for violations of federal civil rights law. You have the right to remain silent." As the Miranda warning was read, Judge Washington finally allowed himself to sit down, the adrenaline of the confrontation giving way to the steady pulse of justice asserting itself. He looked out over the courtroom, seeing faces that reflected shock, satisfaction, and something deeper, the recognition that they had witnessed a system finally working as it was supposed to. "This court," Judge Washington said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "stands for the principle that no one is above the law, not officers, not judges, not officials of any rank or station. Justice delayed is not justice denied when good people decide to speak truth to power." Blake was led away in handcuffs, his footsteps echoing through the marble halls, where he had once strutted with unquestioned authority. The arrest of Sergeant Marcus Blake sent shockwaves through every level of law enforcement in the county, but the tremors reached far beyond the local police department. Within hours of the courtroom attack, the FBI had executed search warrants at 3 precincts, seizing computers, files, and surveillance equipment as part of what Agent Martinez described as the most comprehensive civil rights investigation in the region's history. Lieutenant Sarah Brooks, Blake's immediate supervisor, whose voice had been captured celebrating Isaiah Parker's death, was arrested at her home that evening while eating dinner with her family. The image of her being led away in handcuffs, still wearing her civilian clothes, became the lead story on every local news channel and social media platform. 47 additional officers were placed on administrative leave, pending investigation, their cases to be reviewed by a joint federal-state task force with subpoena power and unlimited resources. "Are you ready to stand up when it matters?" Judge Washington returned to his chambers after the longest day of his judicial career, his face still bearing the faint outline of Blake's handprint. The physical mark would fade within days, but he understood that the symbolic impact would resonate for much longer. His desk was already covered with requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and legal commentaries, but he pushed them aside to focus on a single manila folder, Amara Williams's case file. The charges against Amara were dismissed with prejudice within an hour of Blake's arrest, but Judge Washington knew that the real work was just beginning. How many other children had been terrorized by Blake's systematic racism? How many families had been destroyed by a system that prioritized officer protection over victim justice? How many other Isaiah Parkers had died while good people remained silent? Jordan Martinez knocked softly on his chamber door, carrying a stack of files that represented 3 years of meticulous documentation. "Your Honor, I've identified 43 additional cases involving Sergeant Blake that need immediate review. Some involve children as young as 11 years old." Judge Washington felt the weight of those numbers settle in his chest like stones. 43 children whose only crime had been existing while black in Blake's patrol area. 43 families who had been told their children deserved whatever treatment they received. 43 cases that had been processed through a system designed to protect officers rather than citizens. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "I need you to authorize a special review board with the power to reopen every case Blake touched in the past 5 years. I need subpoena authority to access sealed records, and I need protection for the witnesses who are going to come forward once they realize it's finally safe to tell the truth." The scope of the investigation was staggering, but Judge Washington understood that half measures would only allow the corruption to metastasize in new forms. Done. Draft the orders tonight. We'll convene the review board tomorrow morning. Meanwhile, at the Williams family small apartment, Maria Williams held her daughter close while they watched news coverage of Blake's arrest on their television. Amara had been quiet since returning from court, processing the reality that the man who had terrified her was now facing federal charges for crimes that stretched back years. "Mama," Amara said softly, "was he going to hurt me like he hurt that other boy?" Maria Williams felt her heart break for every parent who had faced that question, every family that had lost a child to the kind of hatred Blake represented. "I don't know, baby, but you're safe now. And because you were brave enough to tell the truth, other kids are going to be safe too." 3 states away, Mrs. Elenina Parker received a phone call from Agent Martinez, informing her that her son Isaiah's case was being reopened as a federal murder investigation. For 3 years, she had been told that her son's death was justified, that he had brought it on himself through some imagined defiance. Now, finally, someone in authority was acknowledging what she had known all along, that her boy had been murdered in cold blood by a man who saw his life as worthless. The institutional changes came swiftly. The police department's entire training curriculum was suspended pending federal review. Body camera policies were revised to prevent the kind of technical difficulties that had allowed Blake's crimes to be covered up. Community oversight boards were established with real investigative power and independent budgets. But perhaps the most significant change was intangible. The recognition that silence in the face of injustice was no longer acceptable, that good people had a moral obligation to speak truth to power, regardless of the personal cost. 6 months after the slap that echoed through the halls of justice, Judge Samuel Washington received an unexpected visitor in his chambers. The woman who knocked on his door was impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit, her credentials identifying her as Associate Justice Patricia Chen from the Federal Court of Appeals. She carried with her an offer that would have transformed most legal careers: nomination to the Supreme Court of the United States. "Judge Washington," Justice Chen said, settling into the chair across from his desk, "your handling of the Blake case has drawn national attention. The President believes your voice would bring essential perspective to the highest court in the land." Judge Washington listened respectfully as she outlined the nomination process, the confirmation hearings, and the lifetime tenure that would elevate him from a local family court to the pinnacle of American jurisprudence. It was an honor that few judges would ever be offered, a chance to shape constitutional law for generations to come. When she finished, Judge Washington was quiet for a long moment, his eyes drifting to the wall where drawings from children he had helped still hung alongside thank you letters from families whose lives had been changed by his decisions. Finally, he spoke, with the same quiet dignity that had defined his response to Blake's attack. "Justice Chen, I am deeply honored by this opportunity, but I must respectfully decline." Her eyebrows rose in surprise. "May I ask why?" Judge Washington gestured toward the window that overlooked the courthouse steps, where a small memorial garden had been planted in Isaiah Parker's memory. "Because the work isn't finished here. Because there are still children like Amara Williams who need someone willing to stand between them and the system's failures. Because justice isn't just about writing opinions from marble towers. Sometimes it's about staying in the trenches where the real battles are fought." Justice Chen nodded slowly, understanding that she was witnessing something rare in Washington's power corridors, a person choosing principle over prestige. "The offer will remain open," she said as she prepared to leave, "should you ever change your mind." After she left, Judge Washington returned to his desk, where a stack of case files awaited his review, each one representing a family seeking protection, a child needing advocacy, a situation where his experience and commitment could make the difference between justice and injustice. The work was unglamorous, often heartbreaking, but essential in ways that appellate opinions could never be. The Blake case had resulted in convictions for 17 officers, including Blake himself, who received a 25-year federal sentence for civil rights violations and second-degree murder. Lieutenant Brooks was sentenced to 15 years for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The police department underwent complete restructuring under federal oversight, with new leadership, revised training protocols, and community accountability measures that served as a model for departments nationwide. But the most lasting impact was measured not in headlines or sentences, but in the children who now walked through Blake's former patrol area without fear. Amara Williams had returned to school with a new confidence, her experience in Judge Washington's courtroom having taught her that speaking truth to power was not just possible but essential. She often spoke to other students about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's scary. The memorial garden outside the courthouse had become a gathering place for families who had lost children to police violence, a space where grief could be shared and hope could be nurtured. Mrs. Elenina Parker tended the roses planted in her son Isaiah's memory, finding peace in the knowledge that his death had not been in vain if it prevented other mothers from experiencing her pain. Jordan Martinez had been promoted to chief court administrator, her courage in exposing Blake's crimes earning recognition throughout the legal community. She used her new position to implement transparency measures that made it impossible for future misconduct to remain hidden in administrative files. David Chen's coverage of the Blake case earned him a Pulitzer Prize for investigative journalism, but he was most proud of the follow-up stories that tracked the systemic changes Blake's exposure had triggered across multiple states. As evening fell over the courthouse, Judge Washington prepared to leave for home, where his wife Angela waited with dinner and stories of her own day, saving lives as a trauma surgeon. The red mark on his cheek had long since faded, but the memory of that moment, when he chose dignity over retaliation, when he let Blake's violence expose itself, rather than meeting it with violence of his own, remained as vivid as ever. That slap had indeed become the beginning of the end for a system built on silence and complicity. But more than that, it had become a reminder that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is simply refusing to be broken by it, standing firm until truth wins, and choosing to stay where the work matters most. Justice, Judge Washington had learned, didn't need a shout to be heard. Sometimes it just needed someone willing to absorb the blow and keep standing, letting the light shine in until darkness had nowhere left to hide. The courthouse lights dimmed as another day of seeking justice came to an end, but the work would resume tomorrow, and the day after that, and for as many days as children needed someone to stand between them and those who would abuse their power. Some battles are won not through force, but through the quiet courage of refusing to step away when stepping away would be easier. Judge Samuel Washington had chosen to stay, and in staying, had reminded an entire nation what justice looks like when it refuses to be silenced. If this story struck you, like, subscribe, and share it so that more people can see that true strength lies in standing firm until the truth wins. Let us know in the comments what moment impacted you the most. Until the next story that will remind you why dignity never goes out of style.